Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is directionality, a new chapter in our discussion of causation. Let's back up for a second and remember why we're talking about causation. This is a class about risk, and a working definition I've given us for risk that will work in most circumstances is that risk is the probability that a stimulus causes a harmful effect. The emphasis here is on cause. Remember in a previous class, before we started talking about illusions, we emphasized that associations are not causation. And that's an important concept because if we just take a simple association and conclude that it's causal, we make mistakes about when risk actually exists. So if it's not association that we're talking about, what exactly is causation? Well, I gave us a definition that we've been working with in a series of classes now, which is a change in a stimulus that determines a directional change in an effect. Now, when we started with this definition and broke it out into different components, there were really three different components to work with. One was the issue about phenomena, or relata, the stimulus and the effect. How do we know that a stimulus exists? How do we know that an effect exists? How do we know that they're changing? That's what we dealt with when we dealt with phenomena. So we're done with that part of it. But there's two other components of causation that we still need to discuss: determination and directionality. And today we're going to talk about directionality, the second component of causation that's important to understand. When we speak of the term directionality, what we're really saying is that causation has a certain arrow that goes with it. It flows from one stimulus to one effect. When I throw a ball at a window, it's the ball causing the window to break, not the other way around. So in other words, another way that we could look at directionality is to say we're eliminating the possibility of reverse causation. When we use the word direction, we're talking about a specific order in which causation occurs. The best way to explain this concept is through examples. And so I've picked out 4 for us here. And for your discussion board questions this week, I'll hope that you can pick out ones that are interesting and relevant for you and your classmates to discuss. Okay, let's get started with our examples. Take the instance, this is a silly, simple example, but take the instance of wind and windmills. There is an association, almost always the case, that the faster windmills are observed to rotate, the more wind is observed to exist at the same time. Now that's a fact most of us can agree with, but if you think about it for a moment, that is merely associational. It is not by itself a statement that shows any causation. Could we ask the following question given this association that we've seen? Namely, do faster spinning windmills cause the wind to speed up? If we think about that for a moment, it should be quite apparent to us that something's wrong, that it's not the way the directionality flows, that in fact the reverse is true. Faster wind causes windmills to turn faster, not the other way around. So we got the causation wrong if we made the first statement, faster spinning windmills cause the wind to speed up. Instead, the reverse causation is the case, faster wind causes windmills to turn faster. This is a very simple idea, but this is what directionality is about. People make this mistake many times when they're discussing topics. This is a simple example, makes us say, well, how silly could people be to make this mistake? But you'll see incrementally that there are more sophisticated situations where people have forgotten to rule out the possibility of reverse causation. Okay, let's take a second example, macroeconomics. There's a statement that's been observed statistically in recent times by a couple of Harvard professors in 2013, where they showed across a number of countries that when a country's debt rises above 90% of that country's gross domestic product, or GDP, that growth in that country is observed to slow. This is an association. They're simply looking at two sets of variables, debt, and growth. And when debt gets above 90% of gross domestic product, they see a strong correlation with slow growth. So, can we ask the following question? Does this mean that high national debt causes slow growth? This is what Reinhardt and Rogoff proposed in their paper in 2013. However, Krugman, a Nobel Prize winner, disputed this claim and said that no, actually the reverse is true. It's the slow growth that is forcing nations to take on debt to fulfill their need to produce and to have income in the absence of actual growth. So in this case, the debate is about which way the directionality flows again. Here, a little more subtle and sophisticated, even Harvard professors not taking into account the possibility of reverse causation. Okay, let's take another example, this time from scientific study of epidemiology. Ask yourself in this case, which phenomenon is the stimulus, which phenomenon is the effect? That's really what we're asking in every one of these directionality cases. Here, the question involves lead paint and children's IQs. There has been an observed association for many years that households with lead paint in the walls tend to have children with subpar IQs, which debatably is a measure of intelligence. And so there's been a conclusion that mentally impaired children have in fact been ingesting lead paint, which causes them to suffer mental impairment. In other words, one causal possibility that comes out of this is that ingesting lead paint in walls, particularly in old homes, causes mental impairment in youth. And many states, municipalities, and even the federal government have regulated lead paint as a result of this study. However, the possibility of the reverse has never been conclusively ruled out in these studies. Namely, what if it's the case that youth with subpar IQs are the ones who eat lead paint off walls, and therefore this association exists? It's not the lead paint causing children to have subpar IQs, but rather the reverse, that the subpar IQs cause children to eat paint that children with normal IQs would not eat. So we have to look at this either way and try to determine which way the directionality goes. But we always must remember directionality exists and try to rule out the reverse situation, which of course would lead to different conclusions about how we would regulate a risk. Okay, let's give another example. Breastfeeding. Here's a quote that for every 1,000 babies born in the United States, 4 will die from formula feeding. In other words, formula feeding is not preferred to breastfeeding, and that if you have children, 4 out of 1,000 children born will die as a result of eating formula food. In other words, formula food causes children to die. And many different agencies have in fact put their names behind such alliances, saying that in fact breastfeeding is very essential to prevent children from suffering premature death. Here's a list of different agencies all endorsing this finding. One of the things that we might ask, though, is something that Fort in 1990 was discussing. If you look at soy formula, exactly the type of formula we're talking about, an infant autoimmune thyroid disease, the illness that can lead to death in children, it's a form of cretinism or mongoloid retardation that occurs in children who ingest potentially certain substances, or they may just be congenitally born with these things and have, as a result, a certain mental impairment leading to death. The finding in Fort's study was that thyroid disease is more common in young children who were fed soy milk formula instead of being breastfed. So, notice what Fort's finding is. It's not a conclusion of causation, as all these different agencies had made, indicating that soy formula causes children to die. Fort's finding, is much more circumspect. All he's saying is that there's an association I have observed statistically between children's being bottle fed and their incidence of thyroid disease, which could lead to death. He's not making a causal conclusion in this finding. But if we're going to try to draw a causal conclusion, since we know association is not causation, and it would be foolish to necessarily regulate associations without further evidence of causation, the question then becomes, which way does this causation run? Does it, for example, run this way? That the soy formula feeding causes cretinism in children. That's what all of those different agencies were saying when they endorsed breastfeeding and told mothers not to feed their children formula. But there's a reverse possibility, one that we have to rule out before we can make this endorsement, namely the following. Is it possible that mothers with thyroid disease who pass on that thyroid disease to their children may not be able to produce enough milk and therefore have to turn to formula feeding? In other words, maybe this is a congenital illness that has nothing to do with formula feeding, and the formula feeding doesn't cause children to get cretinism, but rather mothers who give birth to children with cretinism are compelled by nature of their own motherhood to have to use formula feeding. This would suggest, if that were the case, that we wouldn't necessarily have to rule out formula feeding in all circumstances, nor would it be the case that the formula feeding is the cause of death. It would be a congenital or inborn disease that causes death, irrespective of breastfeeding. So, what I hoped I've shown through these 4 examples to you is that ultimately, to know causation, we have to assess directionality. And to do that means we need to eliminate, first entertain, and second eliminate the possibility of reverse causation. If we don't do that, we might make a gross mistake about causation and therefore about what risks truly exist. Have you thought of any examples yet of what reverse causations you could come up with? Let's hear about them this week. I'll see you on the chat boards.